Good morning everybody and welcome to the second edition of Homeschooling Friday Art Class with me, Adrian Margey. First of all, a big thank you to everyone who joined in last week's class and who sent in photographs of their fabulous artwork. It really has been very inspiring for me to see all of these coming through. And secondly, if this is your first time joining us, you're very welcome and I look forward to working with you. These classes are aimed at giving you an insight into my different styles of work and the techniques that I use. Last week I explained the importance of place to my work, and I just want to remind you that although we can't physically visit our favourite places at this time, we can transport ourselves to them through our art. And with that in mind, I'd like to use today's lesson to explore one of my other favourite places to paint, and that is Mussenden Temple. The iconic Mussenden Temple was built in 1785 by the Bishop of Derry as his summer library. It sits perched on a 120-foot cliff top, high above the Atlantic Ocean, and if you look west from the temple you can take in views of Downhill Beach across to Gilligan Point and Donegal, and looking eastwards you can take in views of Castle Rock Beach, Port Stewart, Portrush and Fairhead beyond. In this week's session I'd like us to build on the techniques that we learned last week when painting Dunluce Castle, and although I have different styles of painting, I'd really like us to consolidate our learning and focus again this week on the themes of flow and colour. Last week we experimented with contrasting a lot of vibrant colour. To mix it up a bit, I'd like to focus on using a more limited palette this week to see what effects we can achieve. As usual, the first step for me is to think of a composition and to sketch that up onto the canvas before I start to paint. And as I said last week, have a think about the thirds rule, where you divide the canvas up into thirds, both vertically and horizontally, and try to use that grid as a guide in which to place the key features of your painting. In this instance, I'm going to give the top third of the piece to the sky and the bottom 2/3 to the cliff and the sea. And then in terms of how we divide that up vertically, this third will contain the temple, this third will contain the distant hills and cliffs, and this third will contain more sky and sea. Again, when it comes to sketching up, I would advise not overcomplicating things. Keep things simple and break them down into their component parts and their component shapes. I'm going to start by drawing in the Mussenden Temple, a rough outline of the temple itself, because for me it's going to be the key feature in this painting. The landscape can fall in afterwards. So the temple itself was based on the temple of Vesta in a place called Tivoli near Rome. So I always think it's pretty amazing that a little building like this was created back in the 1700s in Castle Rock. There's a number of key features in the building that are appealing. One of them would be the dome on top, and of course the pillars as well. And there we go, there is the finished preparatory sketch. And now the real fun can start. Time to pick up our brushes. I'm going to be using acrylic paints again today. Again, if you don't have those, don't worry. If you have some simple poster paints or watercolour paints, they will be just fine. The focus of today's exercise is to use a more limited palette of colours. I'm a big fan of dusk, that small period of time just after sunset and before we go into total darkness, where there's just a very limited amount of light. And if you've ever been to Downhill Beach at dusk, you know it's a pretty magical experience. So for this piece, we're going to conjure up that whole feeling of dusk, and we're going to use quite a limited palette of reds, pinks and purples to do so. So we're going to be using a lot of white in this piece. There's going to be a lot of colour mixing and colour blending. And to mix up the other colours, you know, we're going to need some red, crimson red if you have it, ultramarine blue. So we're going to start again by painting in the horizon using a mixture of white and yellow ochre. And you'll see that this will really illuminate the hills and mountains in the distance. So I mixed up some red and blue to create this almost burgundy shade, and adding some white as well. And I want the darkest part to be at the top of the canvas, and then I'm going to be adding more and more white as I work my way down the canvas until that the wine colour meets the colour in the horizon. We're going to blend those together. And I want you to think about your brush strokes again. I want there to be that sense of flow that we talked about last week whenever we were painting the sky and the land in Dunluce Castle. I want to see that again today. I want to see flow and line. Of course, you get purple tones coming through as well when you mix the red and the blue. Dusk is a time when there's very limited light, which sort of suits this exercise when we're experimenting with a more limited palette. As we work down the canvas, add in some strokes of white in amongst the other, so we can start to blend that colour, so you almost get the effect of bands of colour. You can see I'm using these sweeping brush strokes, and the aim here is to almost to frame the Mussenden Temple with the sweeping lines in the sky. And so there we have the sky, really just using a mix of red, blue and white paint with a little bit of yellow ochre in the horizon line, and using those sweeping brush strokes to frame the temple as the main subject matter. Although the temple was the first thing that I drew when it came to sketching up, it's probably going to be the last thing that I'm going to paint in this piece. Instead, I'm going to work on the background elements, so the land behind the temple, the cliffs, the foreground. And once that's all done, then we can focus our attention on the temple itself. So again, I'm going to mix up some red and blue. Probably want to put more red than blue this time to paint the land behind the temple. I want there to be a contrast between this colour and the sky. Really going to be a base colour over which we're going to add different highlights and tones. Again, using your brush strokes to mirror the contours of the hills. And again, to add in those different tones and highlights, just using a little bit of white to bring out the contours of the land. Although we're essentially using different shades of the same colour, it's really important to make contrasts. So you can see when I'm painting the cliff faces, I'm using a lot of white. I'm adding a lot of white into the colour that I used on the top, so that there is a contrast between the cliff face and the land above it. And then the cliff, you get the chance to use very linear strokes, vertical strokes, again a contrast against the sweeping strokes used in the land and the sky. You can also add in a little bit of the yellow ochre and the white, so that creamy colour, into the cliffs, just to give the piece that little bit of continuity of colour. So moving on to the distant hills here, we're going to use some blue and white and a little bit of red. But mostly you want a bluer colour in the distant hills. So hopefully you can all see okay now. So mixing up lots of white and yellow ochre, we're going to do vertical strokes. When you're painting wet sand, it's a bit like painting water. It's a bit like when we painted the sea last week. And to tie the whole colour palette together, I'll sort of add in a few strokes of the lilac, pinks and purple tones that have been used in the sky. And now with a little bit of white paint on your brush, I need you to do lots of rapid horizontal strokes to create that feel of wet sand. Just add a few vertical strokes of white for added effect. We're working on this area of the canvas. It's a good idea to work on the water next. It's going to be pale blue water, but with hints of the colour from the sky, where the colour in the sky meets the horizon. So a little touch of cerulean blue mixed in with lots of white to create a very pale blue. And again, it's going to be vertical strokes to begin with, just like in the sand. Going back to that colour in the sky, just adding some vertical strokes of that into the water, blending it in with the blue. Now wash out your brush, put a little bit of white on it again, and use that brush to do lots of rapid horizontal strokes again. Don't worry if the water bleeds into the wet sand. That's fine, that's natural, that's as it would be in nature really anyway. So this is a very calming piece. I say dusk is a very calm time. And in this scene I want to just show the waters gently lapping. I don't want any crazy waves. So we're just going to have the foam of the water's edge brought in now. You can use white paint, it's pure white paint, and just simply almost create an outline of the water, like so. And again, use the same idea to suggest the waves. the gentle waves sort of rolling into shore. Alright, so you can see things are starting to take shape. We've got some of the key elements now. We've got the sea, the wet sand, the distant hills, and the land behind the temple. Now we're going to work on the foreground of the painting here, on the cliff that the temple is actually perched on. So we're going to mix up some darker colour, a lot of blue and red this time, just to mark in the structure of the cliff. And to show the contour of the sloping land. And to mark out this wall, the boundary wall, that stops people falling off the cliff, very important, but in this instance it actually helps us to guide the viewer's eye into the painting and towards the temple. It's almost like an S. So we're going to do a lot of colour mixing and blending in this next phase of the piece. A bit like in the sky, I want to use varying tones of purples and burgundies, pinks and reds in the land here. So we're going to have lots of bands of colour mirroring the contour of the land. So to bring a little harmony to the image, I'm going to use some of the colours that we used in the beach, in the sand, so that mixture of white and yellow ochre, just to introduce some more highlights into the land over here. So just a little bit. So now when it comes to adding in the wall, I'm going to use quite a pale colour, a bit like the colour that we used in the sea. It's the stone wall. We just want to contrast it against the surrounding land and cliff. So mixing up some blue and white. And just really enjoy painting that. It's almost like a ribbon leading the viewer's eye towards the temple. Okay, so it's now time to add in the base colour in the temple. We're going to mix up again some white and yellow ochre, a bit like the colour in the sand, and we're going to apply that to the temple. Again, I would advise using vertical strokes here. I suggest using vertical strokes to paint the walls of the temple, but leave the pillars blank just for a moment. They can be painted in after. now we mix up a lilac colour, so that's lots of white, a little bit of red, a little bit of blue to paint in the pillars, acting as a subtle contrast to the walls of the temple. If you have a thinner brush, like me, I would advise using this for the pillars. This is called a rigger. I find it useful for adding smaller details into my paintings. The base of the temple was built with darker stone, so I'm just going to mix up blue and red and just a little bit of white this time, just to create a darker tone. Adding in the dome now, so lots of white, mostly white and blue, and just a little bit of green on your brush, a little tiny bit of green. To create a colour that sort of harmonises with the sea and the wall. And very quickly I'm just going to add in the steps here, using my fine brush. To add in the little urn that sits on top of the copper dome. So that's most of the groundwork done now. I'm going to use my trusty hairdryer to speed up the drying process. That's going to allow us to add in some definition using dark outlines. This is maybe now a good time to change your water. I don't know about you, but mine's pretty muddy. Some fresh water would be good before we add in these crisp dark outlines. So again, mixing up some brown and blue paint to create a very dark brown, not quite black, but dark brown. I'm going to take my rigger brush. Again, I know you might not have one of these at home. You could use a thin black marker or a black pen to achieve the same effect. Using the brush to outline and define all of the key shapes in the piece, all the key components. So you can see the black lines have added a lot of definition to the piece and helped to tie things together. I'm going to add in some white outlines as well, just to add some more contrast and further definition to the piece. And there we have it, my finished depiction of Mussenden Temple in my contemporary style. Just to recap again, this week I divided my canvas into thirds in order to deliver a pleasing composition. I focused again on this whole idea of flow and line in my brushwork, and I also embraced a more limited palette where I used red, blue, white and just a little bit of yellow ochre to create this piece. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you're painting along, and I'd love to see some of your finished pieces. Do send them in via the Adrian Margey Art Facebook page. Until next week, happy painting!